morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Lexi Johnson, and I am our professional liability underwriter here at CID Insurance Programs. I welcome you to our professional liability webinar. We are very excited to have you. This webinar will be about learning the professional lines basics, and I am happy to introduce Kevin Wills as our presenter for today's webinar. He is the second vice president of USLI and very knowledgeable about professional liability. So we are very lucky to have him today. And then, of course, Jacob Cole, who is our lead marketing coordinator, running everything behind the scenes. Before I pass this over to Kevin, I would just like to cover some webinar logistics. So if you've been on our webinars before, you know all participants will be muted, be able to hear but not speak. However, your voice is very important to us. So we have a chat room where you can type any questions throughout the webinar that you may have. So please post them at any time, and Kevin will answer your questions along the way. There will be a short survey Jacob will send out to you after the webinar. We really would appreciate your feedback on that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kevin Wills.
Thank you, Lexi, and thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to be able to present E&O. I know we only have a half hour, and I could probably talk to you for 5 hours about E&O, but we'll go into the basics about what E&O is and how you can use E&O as part of your portfolio as you sell to your clients. So here's what I'm looking to do. I want to give you a better understanding of E&O. I'm going to get into quickly understanding the difference between general liability and professional liability, as these are often confused. Learn who needs E&O and why it would be important to them, and then look at a couple claim examples that I've seen over the years I've been working on E&O products all over the place. Currently, I'm with USLI. I've been managing our miscellaneous professional product for well over 10 years, and I can tell you there's never a dull moment in the miscellaneous professional world. So there's a lot of standard classifications. There's a lot of classifications that, every day someone's doing something new. Lexi and I were just joking before the presentation about how during the pandemic, people have, understandably so, reached out and expanded into areas that they never would have ever been part of prior to the pandemic, just finding ways to survive. So it's really a challenging environment, but it's one that can be profitable. And we retain a lot of policies at upwards of 80 to 85%, which is great. And considering, I apologize for that, but considering that a lot of E&O is contractually required, it's really nice to get on board early as they develop into larger policies. But let's start and talk about general liability, kind of where it stops and where does E&O pick up. So this is really repetitive and basic information, I'm sure, for most of you, but what's general liability? It's bodily injury and property damage as a result of the organization's operations. It's personal and advertising injury within the organization's operations, its products and completed operations. So all the typical stuff that GL would cover. Sometimes, most likely actually, it's going to cover, slips and falls, property damage to other people's property, some libel and slander within, within their communications, within their website, selling or providing goods to the public, damages to premises rented, all typical covered exposures for GL. Sometimes, depending on the form and depending on exclusions, you'll get some abuse and molestation. Every once in a while, you'll get some errors and omissions. It's not very common, but there is a chance that you could have E&O coverage within GL. I would never, ever rely on that. You can get some hired not owned. You can get some coverage for off-premise. You can get some, some host liquor, etc. Here's the things that are definitely not covered. Workers' comp, liquor liability, EPL, and data breach. So cyber liability is a whole different webinar. We're not going to really touch on that much, but just know that EPL, data breach are typically not covered by GL, and quite honestly, E&O is typically not covered within the GL. What you're going to see is exclusions within your GL form. A lot of times it's going to say, and I'm going to point to the one here that says professional services exclusion. Most BOPs, your ISO BOP, or whether it's Hartford, Travelers, CNA, whoever, is going to have a professional services exclusion that's going to basically kick out any chance of E&O coverage. So that all being said, what's the legal foundation for errors and omissions? How does it complement GL? So really what you first have to look at is, what's a professional? Professional, someone who has a specialized talent, someone who uses that talent for their livelihood. Most often it's an intellectual ability versus a physical skill. It's one that requires CE classes, some specialized training, and oftentimes you're licensed, you're certified, you're regulated by states and other professional organizations. Examples of this, I'm sure the first thing that came to everyone's mind was probably doctors, malpractice, doctors, dentists, lawyers, architects. So what I would tell you is these words are used interchangeably. Errors and omissions and malpractice used interchangeably. They're basically the same thing. There really isn't a difference. So these are all classifications you've probably heard of. Other times, you probably yourself, being insurance agents, have some type of E&O, whether it's yourself or through your agency. Very important. Real estate agents, accountants, even consultants need professional liability. One of the real key things about E&O is that you really need to look at what's being covered. That's the most important section of a professional liability policy form, is the description of operations. So you want to make sure that what your client is doing is adequately described in the description of operations. Most oftentimes it's going to say, for example, to say employment agency services performed for others for a fee. That's very common language. In order for E&O claim to be triggered, there are a few things that need to happen. So the first thing that has to happen is that there has to be a professional duty. So it's that higher standard of care. You go to someone because of their expertise. You go to your accountant because they have an expertise in tax matters. You don't go to your neighbor assuming that they have a higher expertise because they didn't necessarily have training. The second part would be a breach of that duty or failure to conform to the standards of that duty. So going back to the tax example, you relied on them for their expertise and somehow they did not utilize that expertise in helping you. There has to be a direct connection or a causal connection between that conduct and the resulting injury. It has to, the financial loss has to be as a result of that professional service. And then that damage has to be directly due to negligence or directly tied to the act, error, and omission of the defendant. That's the real key here. So it has to all be financial loss as a result of negligence by the professional. That's kind of how I would sum all this up. And really, I think this next slide says that very same thing. A client relies on that expertise. Due to this relationship, the client suffers a financial loss. And I keep saying financial loss because the generic E&O form does not cover bodily injury and property damage. If you're relying on it to do so, don't. There are some classes of business when you're in maybe the architectural engineering classes where they'll have it either built in or you'll have endorsements that could cover bodily injury or property damage that result from professional services, but as a general rule, it does not cover BI and PD. There are a few different types of E&O claims that are not necessarily negligence-based. Most of the time it's negligence, but it's intellectual property, it's consumer protection law type claims. So for example, I always talk about intellectual property and like, what is that? A lot of intellectual property is part of what's considered media. And intellectual property, I always use this example or a couple examples. So think about, you always hear of Disney or you hear of Coke. where they have actual people that all they do is surf the internet looking for people that are in some way utilizing their imagery for their own good without permission. And most oftentimes it comes down to cease and desist. But if it doesn't, they're really going to come after you. And if it's somehow they determine that your actions, or the person who's using their image in somehow harms their image, they're going to sue, and they're going to sue for loss of revenue. These claims are very expensive, both to defend and then to indemnify. So I always talk about when you have classifications that are involved in any type of advertising, any type of marketing, any type of graphic design, really make sure that your form has intellectual property coverage, whether it be sublimited or included. The second part there is consumer protection. So you have to be careful. Most E&O forms have consumer protection law exclusions. So you want to make sure that if you have a classification where you're going to run into some potential consumer protection law type of claims, whether that's TCPA with Telephone Consumer Protection Act or fair housing regulations, that your form has an extension to do that. So it just depends. You want to make sure generic forms do not. So you want to make sure it's either endorsed or you have a specific form, like a real estate agent E&O form that addresses certain protection statutes. So who needs E&O? And quite honestly, it's just about anybody nowadays. But here's some stats. They're a little old, a little dated. I need to probably update these. But the key to this next slide here is that more and more the United States economy is becoming service-based. And by being service-based, when you perform a professional service, you need E&O. And I mentioned quickly in the beginning that what we find and what really is great for us at USLI, but really the market in general, is that a lot of times companies are requiring all their consultants, all the people they work with, to have E&O as part of their portfolio. For years and years, it was just GL. Now it's GL and E&O. So we have seen an uptick. As a matter of fact, where a lot of other industries and products within the insurance world have kind of dwindled over the last couple of years due to the pandemic, our E&O products are up bigger than they've ever been. And I think it's because, matter of fact, I know it's because of the contractual requirements that are out there. So this is definitely something that, if you know a little bit, you know a lot. I mean, I mentioned in the beginning, we could spend hours on E&O, but really at the end of the day, it really just is providing coverage for negligence of professional services. So just feeling a little bit comfortable working in this space, utilizing Lexi as an expert, you really can have an advantage over the broker down the street, just feeling comfortable selling E&O. It's really basic, although complex at the same time, if that makes any sense. So who needs it? We already talked about the basic ones. Architects, engineers, doctors, dentists, lawyers. They're all the ones you probably could have spouted out before you came here. But really ones where we've seen a lot of activity in the tech space, specifically the individual consultants, especially as everybody went remote. They were just all over the place, making money and then looking for insurance to cover their errors. Event planners, that's one that now we're starting to see that one come back. For a while that was kind of shutting down. People were doing things more virtually, but now as we're turning the corner, hopefully, lots of events are being planned and they all need E&O. Background checking services, private investigators is another area where you always have some activity. For us at USLI, management and training, this is a specialty of ours. So if you're any type of consultant, needs E&O. They're giving advice that people are relying on to make business decisions. And when they do that, they have an exposure just in case something goes wrong. Other ones, insurance agents, claims adjusters, any of your accountants, whether small level tax preparers, to your CPAs, to your bookkeepers, billing services, riddled with claim activity, because it's easy to make a mistake in billing. That's one that they definitely need E&O. Real estate agents, property managers, for a while there, mortgage field inspectors were something that, we saw a lot of, property preservationists, that type of classification. Home health care is another one, or even the whole allied health industry has exploded over the last 5 years. And these are some of the classes within that realm, the home health care, physical therapists, mental health counseling, social work, all need E&O. Marketing consultants, again, big one, graphic design, event planners. So I went through a list there. We have probably 700 classifications on the books. Some are your generic ones, some are the one-off ones where you're like, well, what's the exposure? I don't know, but they need it for coverage. We have one, I always talk about it, a tortoise relocation consultant. What the heck is that? Or really, what the heck is the exposure? Not a ton, because all they were doing is helping, move, tortoises, tortoise-I, I'm not sure what the plural is there, but from place to place. But again, required by contract, and we kind of decided to write it. Yet we have a beer certification service I like to talk about, close to my heart. But and anytime an underwriter hears certification, you always wonder, you really don't like to write people that are certifying people to do anything, but all they were really doing is kind of something similar to like being a sommelier. What type of beer pairs well with certain foods. So there really isn't a big claim there. Maybe you told me a porter is good with a steak and it wasn't. I don't know what the claim really would be. So we were more than happy to write that type of training program. So these are the kind of things that you want to work with Lexi, because if you put those in, you submit it online. There are some web quoting capabilities, but those are the kind of things that none of your carriers are going to have generic classes for these things. Submit to Lexi. Lexi will work with us. We'll discuss it. We'll talk it through. And a lot of times we're going to go ahead and say, yeah, that makes sense. We can go ahead and offer some terms. And the good thing is that we can usually do it pretty quickly. So this next slide, what does an E&O claim look like? I have two on here. I'll probably tell you about a couple other ones. These are real basic, but this kind of illustrates what E&O is covering. These happen all the time. This is an accountant's claim, and these happen so often. In a nutshell, I don't want to read the entire claim to you, but basically this tax preparer was hired to do taxes for a hair salon, and they did tax returns for them for many, many years. And that salon sold their business. And when they sold the business, they had to release, their profit and loss, their balance sheets to the people that were buying it. And the new owners were relying on that information for, moving forward for, how profitable they thought they would be. Along the way, when they were doing the taxes for the salon, they made some changes, and they really just relied on the word of the salon. They really didn't have a whole lot of proof. They didn't have any documentation. They just made the changes, and lo and behold, without having the documentation, the IRS said, hey, you still owe these taxes, and there was fines and penalties assessed to not only the tax preparer, but to the salon itself. So the E&O form pays for financial loss caused by your client. So this wound up paying the taxes and fees levied to the salon. It didn't pay for the taxes and fees levied to the tax preparer, but it definitely paid for the taxes and fees, or I'm sorry, the fines that were levied upon the salon because of the error of the tax preparer. The second one, and this is a background checking service, and I have actually another one here that I just dealt with recently, but this one basically says, long story short, is that the background checking service, was hired to check the background of people working at a car dealership, and they went ahead and ran the wrong name. They didn't verify it. They ran it through, and they missed a bunch of things. And even though the applicant lied on it, the person applying for employment lied on the application, had all kinds of had a bunch of criminal activity in his background, he was still able to sue because they picked up erroneous data. It's crazy. He was the one that lied, but they were still able to sue because of the erroneous data that was provided by the background checking company. I'll tell you, I have a better example, and this is very similar, is this background checking company was hired to do a background search for, let's say it was John Smith for a university in Virginia, not the University of, but a college in Virginia. And the same thing happened. A background check came back. It had some erroneous information. It basically said that the teacher to be had some history of abuse and molestation. So of course the university said, sorry, John Smith, we can't hire you because of these allegations. John was upset. Of course he'd be upset. He said, this isn't me. There's no way this is me. And after a couple days of back and forth, we found out that they ran the wrong report, and it was corrected. John Smith got the job, and everything we thought was good. John then came back and said, I'm still suing the university for wrongful termination and emotional distress. And the university's like, well, wait a minute, we fixed everything. But he still sued them. The university came back to the background checking service and said, we're being sued here for $150,000. What should we do? And we wound up settling the claim for $100,000. So even though the teacher wound up getting the job, everything was fine, we still wound up paying $100,000 because of the error. So it just kind of speaks to what the professional E&O marketplace is like when it relates to claims. So I went through a bunch there. What's really the difference between E&O and GL? E&O is designed to cover professional services rendered for a fee involving alleged economic damages unrelated to BI or PD. I think I pretty much made that clear. So if the business owner's primary service rendered is a BI or PD or bodily injury or property damage resulting from exposures, most likely you want to look to the GL form first to pick up those exposures. But make sure when you do, you look at both, you look at all the services performed, determine whether GL or E&O is needed, or whether maybe both are needed. A lot of times that you want to consider both. And let me look here. Sorry, I didn't mean to go that way. That's the end of what I had. I'd be more than happy to take some questions. Let me take a look in the chat here to see some of the questions that have come up. Okay, I do see one here. So what classifications do you find yourself writing more now than you did in years past? So at USLI, we've always done it a lot of consultants, as I mentioned, your management consultants and the like. What we found that we're doing a lot more of, we're doing a lot more employment agencies. People are looking to find candidates to work. I mean, we all know about what's going on in the workforce. So they're hiring employment agencies to find people to work for them. We're writing a lot more what we would call DEI consultants or trainers, diversity, equity, and inclusion trainers. That's a big classification, and it's one we've seen a lot of over the last 12 to 24 months. Not necessarily tied to the pandemic per se, but it's based upon what's going on in the world. And we're really seeing a lot of let's say, digital marketing type of consultants. So they kind of bridge the gap between tech consultants and advertising consultants. Tons of exposure as it relates to media. And when I say media, I mean intellectual property. I mean personal injury as it relates to professional services. So those are the two things you're looking to cover there. That's a big class. I mean, everything's being done, whether it's influencers, whether it's advertising agencies. That is such a big exposure at this point. We're seeing a lot of that. And again, in the technology space, that's one that's growing with leaps and bounds.
All righty, I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate your time, and thank you all for joining us. If you have any other questions, please post them in the chat room, and we will even answer them after the webinar closes. We encourage you to visit our website at cidinsurance.com, where we have multiple recorded webinars that you can listen to, and also tools to help you along the way with quoting. If you have any professional liability submissions or questions in regards to our appetite, please send them over to myself or give me a call, and I would be happy to assist you. My contact information is on the slide. We look forward to doing business with you, and for those who are already doing business with us, we really appreciate your partnership. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you, everyone.